Now, the title for today's sermon isn't exactly the warmest, fuzziest title that you will ever see me write for a sermon. It's Disrupting Entropy. And I'm not great at titles anyway, but I'm not going to take the blame for this one because this is something that John Ortberg wrote, so you can't blame me. You can go ahead and blame him for the title. Now, most of you probably know that entropy is a term associated with the second law of thermodynamics. Now, I don't know about you, but the second law of thermodynamics has always been my absolute favorite. Even if the first law is really the second law, and the second law is really the third law, because the law begins with the zeroth law, even though the zeroth law was the last one to be added. If you don't believe me, you can look it up. So the zeroth law is basically the phantom menace of the laws of thermodynamics. But I digress. Loosely speaking, the second law of thermodynamics deals with the availability of usable energy. This brings us back to the idea of entropy. Entropy is the idea that energy tends to move from usable to unusable. More specifically, we could say that in a closed thermodynamic system, entropy is a quantitative measure of the amount of thermal energy not available to do work. But entropy has an additional meaning. Entropy is the measure of the disorder or the randomness in a closed system. Put it in slightly more understandable terms, entropy is the idea that nature tends to move from order to disorder in isolated systems. Let me give you an example. I could spend considerable time and energy cleaning up my office and making everything organized. And as soon as I stop exerting that extra energy into this closed system that is my office, it begins to transform into a disorganized mess almost immediately. So one way to describe entropy is that it's the measure of disorder. Now there might be several of you here thinking today, Grant, that's not what entropy is technically all about. And you're probably right. And I bow to your greater scientific understanding. But I remind you that this isn't a science class, this is a sermon, so let me just state a working definition for entropy as it relates to our life experience. For the purpose of today's message, we're going to say that the idea behind entropy is that everything that's left to itself tends to deteriorate. Everything that's left to itself tends to deteriorate. For example, it used to be that when Sheila and I went away for a few days and the boys were still at home, left to their own devices, chances are that the overall situation at that house would deteriorate into increasing disorder until just an hour or two before we were scheduled to return. And at that point, energy would once again be applied to reorganize the chaos into a somewhat greater state of order. Whether that energy was successful in its goals is debatable, but I would venture to say that in some measurable way, the chaos needle moved more towards the order side of things. Everything left on its own, when not given attention and energy, tends to deteriorate. That's the way it works in life. When you become apathetic or complacent in some area of your life, entropy sets in. And when entropy sets in, hope starts to fade. And dreams start to die. Often we think that the worst thing that can happen to us is that we fail. The fear of failure is common to all lives. We hate to fail, particularly when our failure is public. But failure isn't the worst thing that can happen. We all fail. If you try to accomplish anything of value, it's almost a given that you're going to fail before you succeed. So failure is just part of our expected journey to success. But what happens when entropy sets in? What happens when we learn to settle for the things the way they are? It's at that point that the worst thing that can happen to someone happens. And what's the worst thing? You learn to live with mediocrity. Oh, you may not be completely happy with mediocrity. It's kind of hard to do. Most people aren't completely happy with mediocrity, but lots of people settle for it. Lots of people tolerate it. Lots of people expect nothing more out of life than to live in a lukewarm soup of sloppy mediocrity. Entropy, therefore, is one of the greatest enemies that we have. So it shouldn't surprise us to find out that the book of Proverbs has a lot to say to us about avoiding and escaping entropy. Proverbs instructs that a wise person is always on the lookout for any sign that entropy might be settling in. In Proverbs 27, we're told, "Be sure you know the condition of your flocks. Give careful attention to your herds. For riches do not endure forever, and a crown is not secure for all generations." In the agrarian society of that day, a family's well-being was tied to the success of the farm and of the livestock in particular. And what Proverbs is telling us about livestock in these verses is true of any area of our lives as well. Proverbs warns us about letting things go unattended. In fact, the Hebrew behind "be sure you know" is emphatic. The writer's saying, pay attention. He's instructing us to have an intensity and an intimate relationship with our flock. Proverbs tells us, don't just assume everything is okay without checking to make sure that it's okay. And don't leave it to anyone else to determine everything is okay. This is your responsibility. And just because everything is okay today, that doesn't mean that you can assume that it will be okay tomorrow. In fact, you need to assume that if you're not giving something the kind of attention that it needs, then it isn't going to be okay. If you ignore something, entropy is going to kick in and things are going to start falling apart. So what is the big picture lesson here? It's simply this. Put any important area of your life in autopilot and you're opening yourself up to entropy. If you aren't paying attention to and maintaining an area of your life, you can be sure that that ignored area is suffering in one way or another. It may not look that way from a distance. Some things can look fine on the surface. A quick glance might give you the impression that everything's just fine. But that's why we're instructed to be sure you know the condition and give careful attention. And this proverb is a call to intimate knowledge and personal involvement. And if that's the case, then it's clear to me that each of us is dealing with advancing entropy in some area or areas of our lives. I say that because we're just too busy to be able to be really knowing the condition of or watching carefully every aspect of our lives. Somewhere in our lives, there's a herd or two that are grazing in a field we just haven't had the time to watch. This is particularly true during the last couple of years, right? In this period of COVID, of lockdowns, of isolation, of being stressed out and having difficulty coping with the normal day-to-day realities of life, there's been a greater likelihood that our herds have wandered away from our attention. You know, maybe you've overlooked the field of friendship, or work, or family, or health, or character, or our spiritual lives, or our congregation, or our leadership, or our finances, or our ministries, or a host of other interests and responsibilities. You know, perhaps it's a combination of a few of these fields, or all of the above. Just how much have we missed the last few years as our gaze has been distracted and we've been impacted by a long list of craziness? And just in case you were wondering, Yahweh's not a fan of entropy. That's why he warns us about it in Proverbs. As Paul puts it in 1 Corinthians, for God is not a God of disorder, but of peace. Now, I don't know if you've noticed, but chaos creates stress. I still remember when we had the flood in the church basement a couple years ago, and all of my office was packed off, moved off site, and I was working in one of the Sunday school rooms, and construction was all around me. The amount of stress created by all that disorder was crazy. Chaos is chaotic. There's your wisdom for today. Chaos is the enemy of peace. And that's why God's not a God of disorder. In fact, in the moment of creation, Genesis tells us that Yahweh took that which was chaotic and he reorganized it. That's what this means, is that Yahweh didn't create us to live in chaos. And he doesn't want us to suffer the ill effects of entropy in any aspects of our lives. This is why the book of Proverbs, which is a book about living wisely under the care and concern and direction of our relationship with God, has so much to say about this particular topic, this particular problem. For example, look at what chapter 24 tells us concerning this topic. I went past the field of the sluggard, past the vineyard of the man who lacks judgment. Thorns had come up everywhere. The ground was covered with weeds, and the stone wall was in ruins. I applied my heart to what I observed and learned a lesson from what I saw. A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest, and poverty will come on you like a bandit, and scarcity like an armed man. One of Sheila and I's favorite places is Niagara-on-the-Lake. It's been a few years since we've been there, but usually we stay in Niagara Falls because it's cheaper. And then we take the river road from Niagara Falls to Niagara-on-the-Lake. I love seeing the vineyards that dot the landscape of that drive. I love vineyards because they're so orderly and well structured. You know, when you see a vineyard, what you find is a well-maintained row of vines. It's a beautiful thing. A fruitful, productive vineyard is just marvelous to behold. You look at a vineyard and you can't help but be impressed by the amount of thought and labor that's gone into making the vineyard productive and healthy. But the writer of Proverbs 24 says, I was going past the vineyard and it was a mess. There were thorns all over the place, and the ground was covered with weeds, and the walls were falling down. In Proverbs, the image of a vineyard is used to illustrate the need to work hard because of all the painstaking labor it took to create and maintain and protect the vineyard. The book of Proverbs often also talks about the sluggard. What a great word, sluggard. Sluggard, sluggard, sluggard. It's such a descriptive word. It sounds like it is, right? The sluggard's world is ruled by the land of entropy. So whenever you see the word sluggard in Proverbs, think entropy. And we're told that the sluggard's field is full of thorn and weeds. In other words, there's been a hostile takeover. Chaos was reigning. Fruitfulness had been choked out. But don't miss the point. The hostile takeover simply came because the field wasn't taken care of. In our world, disconnected from agriculture and the land, we miss the full impact of what the writer is trying to tell us. You see, in the ancient Middle East, a good piece of land ensured a good life. They were synonymous. So every effort was made to maintain and nurture and coax a full potential out of one's land. But obviously the land the writer is talking about had been squandered. And since land equals life, this person's life had been squandered. This is what the writer wants us to understand. In this life, everybody gets a vineyard. You have a vineyard and I have a vineyard. When you and I were born, we each got ourselves a vineyard. You got your body, your mind, your will, your soul, and a bunch of relationships to learn from and grow in. Everybody gets a vineyard, and everyone's vineyard is their one and only shot at having a productive life. And the thing is, we don't even have to tend this life on our own. We have God's willing to be partner with us and to ensure us that we will be fruitful. If we place our lives in His care and live according to His will, He helps us. But the so-called vineyard that the writer comes across is owned by someone who just doesn't care. He doesn't care that he's wasting his one and only chance at a successful life. In other words, entropy is set in. The writer of Proverbs says, I was walking past a vineyard and I thought of what it might have been. He sees the vineyard could have been a thing of beauty. It could have been a source of pride and joy and wealth to the owner. It could have been a blessing to everyone around it. But it was none of these things. Then the writer wonders why. Was there a drought? Was there flood, fire, some other disaster? No, it was just sheer negligence on the part of the owner of the vineyard. He had no idea what he had. He was throwing away the opportunity of a lifetime. Entropy had taken over. And this is why entropy is such a dangerous thing. It just happens if we don't care. It just happens if we're preoccupied with other things. It just happens if we don't stop it from happening. This proverb makes me think of a lot of people I've met, including myself sometimes. They aren't happy with their lives. They're not happy with the way their lives are, but they really aren't motivated to change their lives either. Instead, they blame their circumstances on others, or they have excuses as to why they don't get the breaks or the jobs or the promotions. They just stay in their overgrown vineyard convinced that they're the victims of circumstances. People like this have great dreams of what could happen and should happen, but they never do anything to move from where they are to where they want to go. John Ortberg talks about a friend of his who works in the publishing business. People sometimes ask him, how can I become a writer? Everybody wants to be a writer, right? Well, John continues, he'll tell them how it usually happens. You write an article and submit it to a magazine. And then you get rejected. And you submit it someplace else and it keeps getting rejected. And then you write another article and you submit it and it gets rejected. And then you get to know the editor a little bit and you find out more about writing and you keep working on the craft and eventually you write an article and it gets accepted. You keep writing articles for a while and then you do a couple of chapters in a book and then maybe you co-write something with someone else and you just keep learning. Ortberg continues, my friend says that when he tells people this, they have a consistent response. No, that's not what I want to do. I want to write a book and have it sell millions and millions of copies and be rich and famous and humble and give God all the glory. That's what I want to do. There's lots of people who want the harvest of a productive vineyard without doing any of the necessary work of tending the vineyard to make it fruitful. They have fantasies. They want the perfect marriage, the perfect career. They want, the perfect education. And if they can't have that fantasy, they won't do anything. They want perfection, but they don't want to work for it. The problem is that they look at other people's vineyards and see how productive they are, and they assume that it's just that they got a better piece of land. They never consider all the work that went into tending that productive vineyard. So they remain stuck in a fantasy world. Meanwhile, the weeds keep growing higher and higher. But Proverbs tells us to start with reality. Work the land that is your land, your life, your relationships, your occupation, because The vineyard is all that you have, and if you're going to be different in any way, it needs to be invested in with some hard work and faith. It must come from asking for God's help and from submitting to his will. And I've already mentioned that entropy is dangerous because it just happens unless we do something to prevent it. But let's go a bit further and examine. Why is it so easy to let entropy take over? Let's go back to the last part of that passage in Proverbs 24. A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest, and poverty will come on you like a bandit, and scarcity like an armed man. Underline the word little. Notice that it's repeated. A little means a small amount, right? We're not talking about a big deal. It's just a nap here and there. Sleep is in the plural here. Now, one commentator observes that sleep is to the sluggard what narcotics are to the addict. It's the means of escaping the world. The phrase a little slumber emphasizes the fact that the sluggard loses by small surrenders. So it's not like the sluggard loses his life to entropy by strong refusals or dramatic indifference. It's just that the smallness of his surrenders keep him from seeing the seriousness of his problem. The small surrenders add up to a big failure. Little by little, minute by minute, centimeter by centimeter, his life drifts into chaos. Now, I need to point out to you that when it comes to the sluggard, there's never any commentary on his poverty in Proverbs. You know, if their poverty was the result of opposition or abuse or any kind of a system that was keeping them down, it would have been addressed. It would have been noted. It would have been given that context. But the point of the sluggard is that his poverty is self-imposed. He allows entropy to have its way. Disaster comes simply because of his passive procrastination. And I can say that without any guilt because I'm an active procrastinator. I'm not a passive one. All it takes for some aspect of our lives to fall apart is the small phrase, in a little while, or I'll get to it. It's amazing how easy it is to have in a little while stretch into a very long while, indeed. And once upon a time, a man was visiting in the area of the house where he grew up. And so he went by and he knocked on the door. It had been 20 years since he had last set foot in this house. And while visiting, he got all sentimental and asked the owner if he could walk through the house. The owner agreed, and while the man was in the attic, he found one of his old jackets. He couldn't resist the impulse to reach into the pockets to see if there was anything in them. Sure enough, in one of the pockets, he found a receipt for a shoe repair shop from back in the day when people actually got their shoes repaired. And this man recalled that he had taken a pair of his favorite shoes in for repair over 20 years before, and he'd completely forgotten about them. Curiosity got to the best of him, and he made the trip to see if the repair place still had his shoes. When he arrived at the shoe repair shop, he handed the receipt to the man behind the desk. And with a smile on his face, he asked, "Are my shoes ready?" And the owner went back into the workroom for a minute, and then he came back to the counter and he said, "Come back a week from Thursday." That's what happens when we live in the land of in a little while. The problem with living in the land of a little while is that it's a nice land, full of possibilities. I mean, we aren't saying no. We're just saying a week from Thursday. We're just saying in a little while. We intend to do. We want to see it done. We know it. We should do something about it. We are agreeing to do something about it in principle. It's just that, well, life's a bit complicated right now. And I'm not in a position to focus on anything more than I am right now. So I'll get to that budget in a little while. I'll focus on my spiritual life when things slow down. I'll spend more time with my kids and my wife or at the gym as soon as there's a window of opportunity and things are safer. In which case, waiting might be a good idea, but the point is that in a little while leads to overgrown fields. It allows entropy to breed disorder. Proverbs tells us that the entropic sluggard specializes in making excuses. It doesn't take much of an excuse. It could be as flimsy gets. That's how the mind of the sluggard works. That's how the mind of the sluggard is shaped by entropy. Proverbs 26:16 tells us that the sluggards are wiser in their own eyes than 7 people who answer discreetly. In the ancient world, 7 was the number that suggests completeness or fullness. So the idea of this proverb is that in the sluggard's mind, his reasoning for not acting always makes more sense than any argument from real wisdom. In other words, there's a blindness that comes with entropy. Now, my guess is most people would rightly say, I have problems, but laziness isn't one of them. If anything, my problem is I'm too busy. I'm running too fast. I'm working too much. And that might be very well be true for most of us. But that doesn't mean we haven't got something in common with the sluggard. You see, busyness just gives us a greater motivation for being selectively entropic. We may be busy in a bunch of areas of our lives, but that just gives us a greater excuse to let the weeds grow in other areas of the vineyard. Imagine the dad who's pouring all of his energy into a career that's going great, but at home his kids are drifting away. Or what about the mom who drives her family here and there and everywhere, works from morning to night, but her soul is shriveling away inside her? Or maybe it's the couple that has what looks like a great house and a great life and lots of friends and lots of stuff, but they haven't had a meaningful conversation with each other in months. Every day there are more weeds in the vineyard of their marriage. Or what about all the areas of the vineyard that have been roped off or made more difficult to tend to because of shutdowns and limited access and being stuck at home? Most of us have at least one area where there's some entropy. What are we going to do about it? Proverbs tells us to look at the ant. Go to the ant, you sluggard. Consider its ways and be wise. It has no commander, no overseer or ruler. Yet it stores its provisions in summer and gathers its food at harvest. 2 lessons suggested by the ant. First, the ant is self-motivated. He has no commander, no overseer, no ruler. In other words, the ant takes responsibility for his vineyard. The ant doesn't wait around for somebody else to motivate them. So if you expect your boss, your parents, your teachers, your spouse, your friends to make you do the right thing, you're in serious trouble. Ants take care of their own vineyard. Now, that doesn't mean that we must do everything by ourselves. Sometimes taking responsibility means making yourself accountable to someone else. But being accountable to someone else isn't the same as expecting them to do the work for you, is it? Second, the ant understands the law of opportunity. Even in the summer, the ant stores his provisions. Maybe you wish it wasn't summer right now. It's not, but metaphorically speaking. Maybe you're tired and you wish your kids weren't so young and demanding right now. Maybe things are just so busy in the midst of trying to be productive that you haven't got time to think about your future. But those kids are going to be only that age once in their lives. And they'll only be in your care for that period of time that they're in your care. Whatever season you are in, whatever season is your reality, it's your vineyard. Proverbs says that the ant understands time better than we do. We have this one life, and it goes by fast. I mean, it's 2022 for crying out loud. I'm going to be 62 in a few weeks. Our kids are growing up, but I can still remember holding them in my arms just after they were born. I even remember when I had hair. We need to look at the ant and learn how to understand time. Because we have only one vineyard to take care of in our life. And maybe many of us don't want to look at our vineyard because we're ashamed or we're embarrassed. Entropy has had its way for far too long, and now the vineyard seems overgrown, too overgrown, in fact, to bring it back to order, back to fruitfulness. Well, entropy might seem overwhelming and irreversible, but it isn't, because our God is a God of order. And He wants us to have order, and He wants to help. The good news is that Jesus says, just ask me and I'll help you with it. So the question now becomes, where is God calling you to act with His help? Maybe it's in your work life. Maybe it's in your finances. Maybe your vineyard is your soul. Maybe your work and your family and your health are all in order, but you have neglected your soul. Jesus says, what good is it for a man to gain the whole world and yet forfeit his soul? Now, often it is the vineyard of the soul that suffers the most from the effects of entropy, particularly with guys. We can come up with the flimsiest of excuses to satisfy ourselves, but the truth is that we're playing games with time and we're wasting our very souls. But through Jesus, God says, I'll help you. Step towards me. In John's Gospel we read, for God so loved the world that He gave His one and only Son, that whoever believes in Him shall not perish, but have eternal life. If we wanted to paraphrase this verse in the context of today's message, we would say, for God so loved the world that He gave His one and only Son, that whoever believes shall not have entropy take over his life. But instead, they shall have the fruitful vineyard God intended, eternal life. Maybe God is showing you that you never really trusted Him with your soul. Not really. Maybe in this area of the vineyard, you've always said a week from Thursday. This is your day. This is your vineyard. What are you going to do about it? I pray that 2022 will be the year when we disrupt entropy wherever it's found. In our lives, in our hearts, in our faith, in our relationships, in our congregation. Wherever the Lord puts His finger. May we ask for His help. And may we have a happy new year by submitting to His organization in our lives, of His reorganization in our lives. As we come to the Lord's table, I want you to think about it. Where are the weeds? Where's the broken walls? Where are the nettles? Where are the thorns? What part is in disarray? What part has just been left? That's the part that God's interested in. That's the part that Jesus came to redeem. So as we come to the Lord's table, I want you to confess those areas, those weeds, those neglected areas of your life to Him. And not just confess them, but even ask Him. Because sometimes the area where we think we've neglected isn't actually the area He's most concerned in. Come to His table, speak to Him, allow Him access. And unlike the sluggard, listen to His advice. Most of all, be worshipful in the point that He's offered us the help and the grace and the mercy to rebuild. Paul tells us as often as we participate in this meal together, we proclaim the Lord's death until He returns. As we walk into 2022, we're a little bit closer to His return. So let this be a year where we're prepared for whatever comes by simply keeping our eyes focused on Christ. Help us to be a people that sees Christ as, Lord, help us to see You as Your source for everything that we need. You are our hope, Lord. You are our peace. You are the means by which we become the people You've called us to be. You are our satisfaction. And Lord, if we are dissatisfied, use that dissatisfaction to bring us to our knees before You. In this year, throughout this year, help us to be consistent by enabling us to be consistent as we worship You and see You in everything that we do. In Jesus' name, amen.